In the meantime, let's take a look at what is happening in West Virginia. We've got the President of the United States ready to address those Republicans gathering there for their retreat. But, of course, the noise around all of this is this FBI memo, and whether that is pushing out all the other news that the administration would prefer getting out there. It really is in the eyes of the beholder on all of this. To the Washington Examiner White House reporter Gabby Morrongiello, former George W. Bush speechwriter Anneke Green. I'm looking at this and what's at stake, Gabby, and the president could rightly feel a little paranoid here. Every time he has a good day or a good night, something happens to collapse it, and then this FBI thing might be the latest example of that. He always talks about, and the White House always talks about, how that's deliberate. What do you think of that?
I don't think this is deliberate. This is news that we've been following now for several weeks. It just happened to coincide with the State of the Union. And
by the way, this one is a Republican-inspired distraction, but go ahead.
Right. Unfortunately, it's sort of distracted us from that speech that he gave on Tuesday night. You know, we're less than 48 hours after that, and all we can talk about is this memo because there's so much anticipation surrounding the president's decision on whether or not to release it. It does seem like we're moving in the direction.
But the drama's gone, right? It is going to be released. We're going to find out about it, right?
Sources in the White House are saying that he's leaning toward releasing it, although there's some concern both by the DOJ and the FBI about whether or not there should be redactions that take place to prevent sources and intelligence gathering methods contained in the memo from being exposed.
By the way, Anneke, on that subject, we're learning that Senator John Thune is concerned about just that, the idea that this without redactions, I'm making the leap here, just raw release could be a problem, that he is concerned, and that not everyone, for example, on the Senate Intelligence Committee has had a chance to review this. So there are Republicans who are concerned. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think it's justified that they would be concerned. After all, the Republicans are very strong on national security, and historically they don't always want things released, particularly senators like Thune, like McCain, and I think that's warranted. And I think that the president needs to take that into account. He has a choice whether or not to participate in this distraction, and other chief executives in the past have chosen to rise above the fray. Now,
we should say, by doing nothing, he could still have it released, right, within 5 days, which would have been yesterday, I guess. So he could still, without saying anything, get it out there, right?
Right, definitely. And I think he could tell the FBI he wants a version of it because people want to see. But he needs to be aware, and I'm sure his advisors are telling him, that that actually feeds the flames. It becomes something then all the reporters and people like me will be picking over the memo. What are the sources? Who said what? Right. And it really can lengthen it.
It's easy to play politics with that. We try very, very hard, as I like to tell viewers, and you've been on the show many times, Gabby, that I try not to be red or blue about this, but just green. And the green folks, the money folks, don't seem to care about this. And I always wonder when they are so nonchalant or dismissive, whether they're walking by the graveyard here and whistling a bit too much, that this could be a problem for the markets. This could be a problem, period. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, including Senator Thune, have talked about the national security implications of releasing something like this, a detailed memo that does contain certain government secrets or does allude to different intelligence gathering methods. And I think that if this is released without any redactions or without any careful edits to make sure that those types of secrets aren't exposed, it is going to have some effect on the market. And I think that in leading up to this moment of whether or not it's released, we've already seen some of that. So there is a certain nervousness surrounding this and something that's certainly going to have an impact whether or not the president does decide to release it.
Anneke, what would the big deal be, though, if we have this sort of disinfected view of the FBI? The Democrats were concerned that Jim Comey was on a cabal against Hillary Clinton before he wasn't, and then he was, and then he wasn't. Who knows? So they were concerned. Republicans have had their beefs with securities agencies over the years. We can all remember, at least I can, I'm much older than you guys, the Pentagon Papers, and people who once trusted the Pentagon and our most important national institutions for their honesty, that once we got into it and looked into it, we found out they're not always honest, they're not always forthright, they're oftentimes driven by political motivations. What's wrong with getting that out there?
Well, I think people need to remember it's not whether people are biased or not, whether you work at an agency or otherwise. Everybody's biased. It has to do with whether that bias, that leaning, affects how you're doing your job. And like you alluded to, James Comey, first he was, then he wasn't. Right. And I think people can see that. But the question becomes, is it bad for the president to be seen as feuding with his own people? He is there he needs to set a direction, but when there's always these questions of, is he going to fire the special investigator, is he not? At a certain point, I think it behooves him to rise above it and let people do the feuding for him.
Oh, no doubt. And I agree with that sentiment. I'm sorry I misrepresented myself here, but do you think that in doing this, if there was a clear indication, at least early on, that they were targeting Team Trump or people around him, based on something that proved to be a specious memo, and we don't even know at the time whether, with his dossier, that they even knew at the time that it was a trumped-up thing, or for that matter, funded largely by Democrats, but that it became the means by which they would go after, a presidential campaign team, and that should be looked at.
Well, that's something we want to know for sure, but it doesn't need to be the White House that gets that out there. That runs the risk of looking petty.